The dress didn't fit. The sleeves swallowed her arms. The hem dragged across the stone floor like a shroud. She was 9. And they told her she was a wife. The veil pressed against her face, scratching her cheeks, dimming the world into lace and shadows. Above her, the Russian Orthodox bells tolled. Not for joy, not for love, for a burial of childhood. The hall was cold. Stone walls breathed damp air. Candles smoked, wax dripping, the scent clinging heavy. Whispers slithered through the silence. Warnings passed from one mouth to another. Good girls obey. Good wives don't cry. Beside her stood a man twice her age. His hand gripped hers until her knuckles turned white. Rough skin. Fingers like shackles. A monster in ceremonial robes. She didn't dare look up. She didn't dare breathe too loud. The priest mumbled prayers, voice hollow, eyes glazed. To him, it was a duty. To her parents, it was a triumph. Her mother's gaze shimmered with pride. Her father's lips curled, already counting the wealth, the land, the favours this marriage would bring. The guests smiled, as if they weren't watching a child being led into a cage. She still slept with her doll. She still hummed to herself at night to fall asleep. She still believed the world was bigger than her small window. But here, in this chamber, in front of God and men, she was stripped of all that. Her lips trembled beneath the veil. Her heart beat so fast she thought it might break free of her chest. And then, the man leaned down. His breath reeked of wine. He whispered just loud enough for her alone to hear. Smile, or I'll make you. Applause erupted. Music struck. The candles flickered. She forced her lips into the smallest curve, because obedience was survival. Someone pressed a flower into her hand. The stem shook in her tiny fingers. The world spun with laughter, feasting, celebration. But she wasn't a bride. She was a sacrifice. And when the doors behind her closed, the sound echoed like iron bars locking. 9 years old. 9. And already a wife. The chamber was bigger than her entire home. Walls too high. Bed too vast. Silence so heavy it pressed on her chest like stone. She stood there in the same dress, hem torn, sleeves damp with tears she hadn't dared to shed. The door slammed shut behind her. The bolt slid into place, and she understood. There was no way out. He entered with slow steps, boots striking the floor, each one louder than her heartbeat. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The way his eyes lingered, the curl of his mouth, it told her everything. When she flinched at his touch, he smiled, not kindly, but with the hunger of someone who had waited a long time to hurt something small. That night, she learned the first lesson: silence. Good wives don't cry. Good wives don't resist. Obedience was not praised, it was demanded, and every time she hesitated, his hand reminded her. The next morning they congratulated her. Brave little bride. She did well. They gave her sweets, silks, braids, compliments. Not once did they ask if she slept. Not once did they ask if she bled. The servants knew. They whispered behind doors, but never interfered. When she winced, they told her, better him than worse. You must have given him reason. And when they dressed her bruises, they pressed cloth colder than their words. No affection, only rules. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't laugh too loud. Don't eat before he does. Don't cry where anyone can see you. Every rule carved her smaller. Every order erased another piece of the child she had been. And she obeyed, because she learned quickly. Attention meant pain. When he ignored her, she could breathe. When he looked at her, she braced. By 10, she was already gone. Not dead, not free, but a ghost in her own home. a child in silk drifting from room to room, unseen, unheard, untouched by kindness, alive but hollow, silent but watching. And in that silence something dangerous began to grow. It began with the smallest mistakes, a glance held too long, slap across the face, a question asked too softly, locked away in the dark until morning, a step taken out of place, wrist twisted, arm yanked, bruise hidden beneath silk sleeves. They never called it what it was. They called it correction. They called it discipline. They said she was headstrong. They said she needed to learn. But what they meant was this: she needed to forget who she was and remember who she belonged to. Every lesson left a mark. Every bruise carried a message, and every message was the same. Obedience is survival. At first, she cried, quiet sobs into her pillow, shaking shoulders hidden in the folds of her gown. But tears made no difference. Tears only fed him. So she stopped. She stopped flinching, stopped pleading, stopped resisting. And with every silence, every stillness, she became harder to read. By 11, she was stone, a face with no reaction, a body that moved when ordered and froze when watched, alive, but hollow. And in the long nights, when the bruises ached too much to sleep, she sat before the hearth, staring, watching the flames chew the logs, sparks lifting into the blackened air. She wished her thoughts would burn the same way, that her memories would turn to smoke, drift upward, and disappear. But they didn't. They stayed, silent, heavy, patient. By 12, she no longer cried, no longer spoke unless summoned. Her silence wasn't modesty. Her silence wasn't defeat. It was calculation. It was a mask she was learning to wear, because even as they beat the words out of her, they never touched the part that was listening, the part that remembered, the part that was waiting. And while they believed she was breaking, she was building, not hope, not rebellion, something quieter, sharper, strategy. Silence had been forced on her, but silence gave her something unexpected. It taught her to listen. When words were forbidden, ears became weapons, and she used them. She noticed things others missed. The way men bluffed louder when they were afraid, the way servants gossiped when they thought no one was listening, the way nobles argued in circles, spilling secrets in the heat of pride. She stored it all, every slip of the tongue, every whispered name, every promise, every fear, every weakness. Her mind became a vault, a memory palace built stone by stone, rooms filled with faces, shelves lined with secrets, doors marked with alliances that could be opened or destroyed. And while others thought she was empty, she was filling herself with power. At night, when the house slept, she lit candles in secret. Her small hands traced the pages of forbidden texts, religious writings, court chronicles, tales of widows who ruled estates after their husbands' deaths, stories of queens who bent kingdoms without raising a sword. Each word was a seed, each page a map. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was studying. She realized something terrifying. Power doesn't begin with strength. It doesn't begin with force. It begins with knowing. By 13, she was no longer a victim. She was a strategist in disguise. A child dressed in gold, but beneath the silk, steel was forming. Her first act of control was subtle, withholding reactions. When her husband raised his hand, she did not flinch. When he shouted, she did not cry. When he glared, she stared past him. And it unnerved him more than defiance ever could, because men like him only know how to strike when something is already broken, and she was no longer breakable. Around her, the nobles underestimated her. They saw a silent girl, obedient, tamed, They forgot to guard their words. They forgot to hide their sins. And she listened. She recorded it all silently, not on paper, not in ink, but in memory sharper than any blade. She had become the shadow in the corner of every room, the child they ignored, the child who never spoke, and because of that, she was the one who knew everything. The hall glittered with candlelight, silver cutlery, goblets brimming with wine, laughter swelling like smoke against the high ceiling. She sat where she always sat, 3 seats down, a girl in pale gold, silent, polite, almost invisible. And then it happened. A noble leaned forward, eyes sharp, smile cruel. His joke circled her like a vulture, wrapped in clever words but stripped of kindness. A joke about a wife's worth, about obedience, about silence. The table erupted. Laughter spilled. Even her husband grinned. She did not. Her eyes lifted, steady, unflinching. And for the first time in years, she spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, precise. If your wit were as sharp as your sword, perhaps you'd still have both hands. The room froze. A servant dropped a goblet. The noble across from her choked on his pheasant, and the man who made the joke stared at her as if the chair had spoken. Her husband's face flushed red, not with rage, with confusion. He didn't understand what had just happened, only that he didn't like it, only that the room had noticed. She lowered her gaze, lifted her cup, took a slow sip, and the silence that followed was louder than all the laughter before. That night, he struck her. Twice. The sting burned her cheek, but it faded quickly, and this time she did not cry, because she knew why. He had heard her, they had heard her, and now they would start watching differently. The illusion was cracked. The women who once pitied her leaned in closer. The men who once ignored her lowered their voices. Servants moved quicker when she entered the room. She had drawn blood without lifting a hand. She had carved silence into a blade. And now, they would never mistake her stillness for weakness again. Her silence had become her weapon, and she had just made her first cut. It began with a disappearance, a noble who laughed too freely in her presence. Gone. Sent abroad, they said. No letters, no funeral, no explanation. Then a steward. One day he stood by the ledgers. The next his place was filled by another. No one spoke his name again. And then, the priest. The same man who pressed a veil over her face when she was 9. The one who mumbled vows as if he were half asleep. He too faded from history. No blood touched her hands. No rebellion marked her steps. Only silence. Only rumour. Only fear. And in that silence she grew. Widows came to her for advice. Quietly, carefully, when no one was looking. Clergymen whispered questions about disputes, about lands, about promises they dared not speak aloud. Even seasoned nobles lowered their voices when she passed, cautious not to say too much. She listened. She answered sparingly. Never too much, never too little. Just enough to make them return. Just enough to bind them to her. By 15 the pattern was clear. By 16 it was undeniable. She was no longer the silent bride. She was the listener in every chamber, the shadow behind every decision. The court moved around her presence, though no one dared to name it. She held no crown, she bore no title, but widows obeyed her counsel, clerics guarded her approval, nobles measured their words when she was near. She'd become the advisor no one admitted to having, the strategist no one could see, the power no one could confront, all with silence, all with patience, all with memory sharper than steel. At 16 she ruled no throne, yet Russia's inner court already answered to her. When she entered a room, the air shifted, the laughter dimmed, The whispers softened. Even the candles seemed to burn straighter. Guards stepped aside before she reached the door. They opened it without being asked. Servants moved faster, eyes lowered, hands trembling just enough to betray what they felt. And the nobles bowed, not out of respect, out of calculation. By now, they understood. Every word spoken near her might be remembered. Every secret could become a weapon. Every silence might already hold their ruin. Her husband, the man who once dragged her through corridors, who once twisted her wrists until they bruised, now paused before acting. He asked her opinion, not because he loved her, not because he feared her, but because he knew better than to ignore her. She did not need his affection. She did not need his permission. What she had was far greater. She ruled without throne. She ruled without crown. She ruled without army. Her army was silence. Her throne was memory. Her crown was whispers that spread from chamber to chamber until the court bent around her like smoke. At banquets, she spoke little. But when she did, her words landed with the weight of decrees. At councils, she rarely interrupted. But her presence alone guided the decisions. Men who once dismissed her now measured every syllable when they spoke in her shadow. She wore no jewels but pearls. She gave no orders, yet her nod carried more than a king's command. She needed no sword. Her silence was sharper. And so, the game shifted. Russia began to bend. Not openly, not in proclamations, but in the quiet adjustments of men too cautious to cross her. History would never write her name beside crowns or thrones. The records would call her a wife, a consort, perhaps obedient, perhaps silent. But in truth, she was already sovereign. Her reign was not carved into monuments of stone. It was written into the fear in their voices, the hesitation in their laughter, the silence that followed when she entered. She was not crowned. She did not need to be, because by now, even Russia itself knew who held the crown of shadows. Power built from trauma is not victory. It is survival. Yes, she gained authority. She bent nobles to her will. She carved her place in silence and shadows. But freedom, gone, childhood, stolen, happiness, a ghost she could no longer remember. There was a rumour, whispered only once, that she wept, in a chapel, late at night. A single candle flickered, then died too soon. She knelt on the cold stone floor, hands clenched, eyes lowered. No prayers, no words, no pleas, just silence. The same silence that buried her at 9, the same silence that rebuilt her at 16. And when she finally rose, there were no traces of tears. Her face was calm, her steps composed, her silence impenetrable. History remembers her power, the sway she held, the fear she inspired, but not her pain, never her pain, because power is a costume, and she wore it so well that even she forgot sometimes what it felt like to be small. She was 9 when they placed a veil over her face, 9 when they buried her childhood in silk and silence, and yet, years later, she walked as an empress of shadows. No crown, no throne, no titles carved in stone, but power followed her. Whispers bent to her. Men hesitated because of her. Her story is not a tale of triumph. It is not victory. It is survival turned into strategy. It is silence sharpened into a blade. They thought they had broken her. They thought they had buried her. But instead, she rewrote the game. They never crowned her. She didn't need one. Because in the shadows of Russia's history, she already ruled. And if you're still here, it means you listened. You cared. You carried a voice history tried to erase. Share it. Remember it. Because stories like hers are why we tell history differently.